Hey guys, it's Sam, and today I'm going to talk about some literary science fiction and fantasy recommendations. So in some recent videos I've talked about my not quite love for literary fiction, or at least like dark, angsty literary fiction, and that I prefer more of a literary style of genre fiction like fantasy or sci-fi, and some people asked me for some examples of that. So if you're not aware of what literary fiction really is, there's no real actual definitive definition for literary fiction, but typically speaking it is more focused on the characters and the writing than necessarily the plot. And I wouldn't say that all these books aren't like good plot-driven books, but I would say that these are much slower, which is more of a characteristic of literary fiction in a lot of ways, and are more focused on really like the story of the characters or the style of the writing, or just maybe some of them have more of that writing and prose. So that is why I consider them more literary SFF. So the first book is an adult science fiction, and that is Too Like the Lightning by Ada Palmer. This is a book that I read at the very beginning of 2019, and I still think about it, and it's so weird. But this is one that I feel like falls in the more literary side of things because it is definitely more character focused. The plot is kind of hard to follow and is sort of like amorphous, and it definitely has a more like literary writing style and has more like beautiful lines than other sci-fi that I've read. I've done a review on this because this is a book that I wouldn't necessarily recommend across the board. It is definitely much darker. You're following a narrator slash protagonist who is not someone that everyone's going to want to necessarily read about, and you don't find out about that until like later on in the story. So I just recommend doing your research on this book before reading it. But I find this series, because this is the first book in a series, intriguing, and it again is definitely more of like a slower paced, complex, character driven, prosy story for sci-fi. The first books that I actually thought of when thinking of this list were The Night Circus and The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. As you guys know, Erin Morgenstern is one of my favorite authors, and these books definitely are like crossover literary fiction, just normal fiction. They aren't always placed, especially The Night Circus isn't always placed in the fantasy section of bookstores, even though it has magic in it. So this definitely falls into more literary fantasy category. It's more contemporary fantasy, which sort of helps that because you're really not going to see literary stories in some of like the more high fantasy genre stuff. And these are definitely slower stories, more complex stories. They're more focused on theme, they're more focused on characters, and a lot of these more literary fiction type genre fiction is more polarizing. So you'll find that people kind of either love it or hate it, because if you're not connected to the characters and the themes and the writing style, the beautiful writing style and the atmospheric writing style of like these books, for example, then you're not going to really enjoy them. But these are two of my favorite books of all time, so highly recommend. Another more literary fantasy is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This is a post-apocalyptic fantasy story, and the writing is definitely much more complex in the world building and such. I feel like there's much more of a character study going on here, and I do feel like, especially in the first book, N.K. Jemisin plays around with some of the writing styles and such, because there is a second-person narrative in here, which is a style that you don't usually see. There is also third person and first person. I think it's just third person and second. So yeah, if you're not into second person, I'm usually not either, but I really like how it was done in here. So N.K. Jemisin plays a lot more with like more literary type themes, more just exploration of characters and character arcs, and this is less plot driven, although there is a lot of like actiony stuff in here. I feel like it's definitely more based around the characters than the action of the plot. Then we have The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, mostly for the writing style and the fact that, again, it's very character focused. It's focused on one main character of Quoth. He's telling his whole life story, and you only get like his, what, teenage, like birth to teenage years in this story, and is just very dense, character driven, with really solid writing in this story. Not so much, again, for like themes. The themes are much more like typical genre fantasy, but this definitely has the more lyrical prose and complex character focused story that you would get with literary fiction, which is again why it's polarizing, because a lot of people hate Quoth. I don't, but I've only read this book. Then we have The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender. This is a magical realism, fabulism story, and it follows 3 generations of women, the most recent one being born with angel wings, I believe, or just being born with wings, and then her mother and her grandmother and sort of the magic that has flowed within their family. So it feels like a generational story, which is something that is very common in literary fiction and is very character focused and focused around a particular family. I also think that other magical realism stories like When the Moon Was Ours and Wild Beauty by Anna Marie McLemore would be more literary fiction-y type genre fiction, because again, it's magical realism, which sort of is this crossover between literary fiction, in my opinion, because you're having more focus on like very sort of purple prose, very interesting prose, and it's fantasy but not, because you're not sure if these things are actually happening or if they're just metaphor. So they're much more character focused than plot focused, and they're much more focused on the writing than other young adult fantasies would be. Then we have The Queens of Ennis Lear by Tessa Gratton. This is a King Lear retelling, and it's a standalone, but there are companions that are going to be in a series of sort of like Shakespearean retellings, so this is in a fantasy world. But again, the magic system isn't as like complex as like an epic fantasy. It's a lot more political, but again, feels like it's much more of a character-driven story. You're much more focused on the characters and their relationships to one another, and also the writing in here. So it's definitely a slower story. I also feel like there's a lot more just kind of like character angst, not in the like genre fiction way, but in just like the character relationship angst that you get in more literary fiction. And this felt like much more of a literary fiction. Also because I feel like it's based on Shakespeare, and that just gives it that more literary fiction feel. And lastly, we have The Grace Keepers by Kirsty Logan. This is probably also similar to The Night Circus and is probably often shelved in the normal fiction section or literary fiction section. This is much more, again, focused on the writing, a slower story. This takes place in a world that is mostly covered by water, and I think it might be the future, but that's not really clear. And our main character has some connection to the sea, so there's kind of like Selkie stuff mixed in, and she does travel in a like traveling water circus. And there are actually two characters that you're kind of focused on, and one of them lives on land, but I forget what she's doing because I read this like 4 years ago. But this definitely has that more like lyrical prose, focus on characters, and just a slower story, not really about the plot. So that is it for some science fiction and fantasy recommendations that have a more literary twist to them. Comment below and let me know if you have any literary SFF recs for me. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.